And if we can go into a hospital setting with someone who is hooked up to machines, who is suffering a lot, with that understanding for us, then even if that person doesn't have the hope that we wish they had, we can hope for them. I've noticed this as a priest myself when I go to visit people in the hospital so often, and sometimes they're not even Christian. I've been called to the ICU and someone said they just need someone to talk to. Great, I have a little bit of time, I'll come talk to you. That what I bring with me as a Catholic priest, this witness of what I wear and what I stand for, gives people an idea that maybe there is something more than just this, right? And we as Catholics, when we go to someone's bed at the end of life, especially, can carry that hope with us. To be joyful around them. To not just pity them, but to rejoice in the fact we've been invited into co-redemption. That after this moment of suffering and pain, we hope for the reality that they will be perfectly happy with God in heaven. We can bring that great good with us to the deathbed, to the suffering, to those in the hospital, to those in the nursing home, whether we know them or not. That is a great and valiant gift that we as Catholics especially can give in the midst of this conversation. So those are kind of the general principles that's just good to kind of understand. Happiness, what it is, what we're destined for. Freedom, we don't have to have an evil thing to choose, we just need two good things. Stewardship of life, we're not the owners of it, we're just to be good stewards of it. And suffering is a reality, but it's not beyond redemption, it's not beyond holiness, but it's the royal road of the cross. So are there any questions at this point? The basics of morality, if you will. Great. I'm that good of a teacher. I knew it the whole time. Kidding. So, now we're going to move into the nitty-gritty details of a few specific examples where the fun really begins and the rubber hits the road. But let me give you a few kind of disclaimers before we begin. Remember that all ethical cases take place in different circumstances. So what I'm going to give you tonight are some specific tools, principles by which to make decisions, but they're not very clear-cut, easily applied to every single situation throughout the world. Because the person who right now is in Colby Hospital on food and nutrition is in a totally different place, even morally speaking, than the person in Junction City. Because of their history, because of where they're at in their sickness, because of the degree to which the food and hydration is affecting them, all sorts of things need to be talked about. I can't talk about every minute little detail in a talk, or all I would talk about was minute details, and you would all go to sleep. More so than perhaps you already are. So, I'm not going to get that deep into the particulars. As one of my theology professors said often, he said, when doing theology, stay in the clouds. When you descend to earth, it gets real messy. So we're going to try to stay in the clouds as much as possible, but with ethics, we're going to have to get a little messy as well. So I know there's going to be things that maybe don't make sense or need to be clarified. So please don't hesitate to say, Father, really, I don't get that. Please, because then I can clarify it. Otherwise, I assume you just get it, and I'm a great teacher, and everything's clear, and we're just going to move on happily. So don't hesitate to do that. So that's my disclaimer for that. Also, secondly, let me give a little basic kind of primer to the reality of advanced directives and living wills. So they exist, people have heard of them. Often when you go to the hospital, they ask those questions, do you have a living will or advanced directives? In general, I'm going to say it again, in general, not particular, there might be other cases that are outside of this, but in general, the best practice to have is a health proxy. A human being that knows you, that knows what you believe, your faith, that respects you, and that can actually respond to the particulars of a situation. Best practice is a health proxy. A spouse, a child, a trusted friend, a priest, whatever it has to be, someone you can trust to make those difficult decisions in those difficult moments according to your wishes. I really recommend this with families. So I've actually sat down with some families here and there to talk through. They're totally healthy. Parents are maybe in their 50s, somewhat grown children, maybe in their 20s. Right? No one's at any point close to death. There's no horrible, prognosis of something happening. But we just have a beautiful conversation about, hey, if something were to happen, here's what mom and dad wish. Here's what we want. And this is why we want it. Right? Nobody wants to have that conversation, but I've always seen it bear beautiful fruit for families. So I highly encourage you to have that conversation if you can. I'm not going to force it. Pray to the Holy Spirit, ask for the gift of counsel, guides us in those particular conversations, and then have those conversations. So that if an accident or something happens, everybody's not just standing around going, I don't know what Dad wanted, I have no clue. Like, we never talked about this. For me as a priest, when I show up, that's the hardest thing, because now I have to try to lead the family through not only a tragedy, but then also ethical questions that could have been dealt with beforehand. And they're sometimes hard to receive ethical answers. So have the question. Then specifically with advanced directives and living wills. They can be very dangerous. Because sometimes what they ask for, there's one common thing that's out there called the 5 wishes or the list. They have a bunch of different names, but what it says is like, if I get into an accident and I no longer have use of my reason, or however they word it, I don't want. And then you list off all the things you don't want. Well, right now, sitting in a soft sofa chair without any idea of what that's like, I don't want those things. But if you just had an accident and you actually want to be saved, you might actually want those things. So a piece of paper can't respond to particular needs of a moment. A human being can. So again, health proxies are the best decision. Advanced directives are not bad, but they just can be misused. The NCBC, National Catholic Bioethics Center, has a beautiful advanced directive example and a health proxy form that are legally accepted in Kansas. At least I know for sure in the hospitals around where I'm at in Junction City. So you can check with a lawyer, those kind of things. For a good example, again, I would love to, that could be its own talk, advanced directives and living wills and that whole kit and caboodle. I just wanted to give that basic idea. Best practice, health proxies. You can have advanced directives. Just make sure they're Catholic and they state in there like, I don't want you to kill me. I don't want you to give me morphine beyond what's necessary so you don't kill me that way. So essentially it's all different ways that we can kill people now, saying, don't do that to me. Because I'm a human being with dignity and I want to live. I choose life, not death. That's very basically put. So any questions about that? Great. Thirdly, all this talk about end-of-life care and the rest comes in this context of a culture that has this catchphrase of death with dignity. All right, so I just want to touch on that briefly. Again, that could be its own talk. We can delve deeply into where that comes from and all the rest. So there's a lot of nuances I'm not going to be able to talk about. But that whole idea of death with dignity defines dignity in an anti-Christian way, or in an un-Christian way. Because what it says is that when I come up to the bed of someone who's, let's say, just got in a car accident, they're brain dead, and there's really no hope that they'll regain function of their brain. What death with dignity says is that person has no quality of life. They have no purpose for being. Depends on how they want to word it. They don't put it in that way because that's not politically correct. But that's essentially what they're saying is we have subjectively determined that this person no longer fulfills a purpose according to what they wanted or what we want. And so therefore we should help them pass, are the words that are often used. Now, as Catholics, as Christians, we believe that human beings have dignity, inherent and inviolable, that does not change based upon what you can do. That little single cell embryo zygote inside of the womb can do nothing for you. Might make you sick if you're a woman, sometimes. But it can't do much for you, right? It's not going to play the piano. It's not going to solve math problems. It's not going to cure cancer. So according to that same definition, that doesn't have any dignity. Thus, abortion's okay, contraception's okay. But as Christians, we know that that single-cell zygote, which I'm going to talk about at the very end of all of this, has true dignity. Dignity that's the same as you and I, not based upon what it can do, but because of who it is. because it is a child of God created out of his love and cooperation with a mother and a father, and that's beautiful, and that's wonderful, and that must be respected. So no matter what you can do or can't do, doesn't matter, you have dignity. So this whole idea of death with dignity defines dignity in an improper sense. And again, you won't see that in their literature, but just remember that when you see that. Ask them the question if someone challenges you with this idea of, yeah, but don't you want people to die with dignity? Ask them specifically, what is dignity? What does it mean to have dignity as a human being? And they'll give you a list of things that people do. That's extrinsic, not intrinsic. It's not based upon the reality of human beings, it's based on what they do. That's not how we define it as Catholics and Christians. So that's just a good distinction as we enter into the reality of this. Any further questions? Like there are some questions that somebody has. Because you all have them, you just don't know what to ask them. So let's get into the nitty-gritty details of the reality of food and water. Food and hydration. Nutrition, hydration. This became an extremely big topic in America with Terry Schiavo. That case, there's been a number of other ones, legal cases, all the rest. I'm not going to go through the legal cases. We had a whole class on law and bioethics, so I could, but we're going to stick to the basics. As I'm talking about these different cases, I'm going to talk about food and water, and then also palliative care, because I want to redeem that name. It gets a bad rap, which is mainly about sedation at the end of life, morphine the rest at the end of life, treating of suffering and pain at that point. As we're talking about both of those, just have this definition of euthanasia in your mind. This comes from the ERDs, which essentially euthanasia, this definition comes out of the document from the CDF. Euthanasia is an action or omission that of itself or by intention causes death in order to alleviate suffering. So euthanasia is an action or omission, either one. So it's called active or passive euthanasia that of itself or by intention causes death in order to alleviate suffering. So just remember that. I'll come back to it as we go through. Specifically with food and water. We're going to start with this quote from John Paul II, just because it gives a very clear kind of synopsis of the reality of what food and water is. The administration of food, of water and food, even when provided by artificial means. So that's like the feeding tube that goes through the nose called the nasogastric tube. Could be an enteral tube that goes through directly to the stomach. It could be TPN feeding, which is into the intravenous system. All of those are different means, artificial means of providing food. Essentially, you can think of it like back in the day, if you wanted to feed someone, you got a spoon and you stuck the spoon in their mouth, right? A lot of parents have done that with children, maybe with each other. I don't know, like the wedding, right? They all feed each other cakes. So you fed somebody, congratulations, through artificial means, a fork. The reality is that we're going to have a conversation here in a little bit about the reality of means of feeding someone. And that's very key. So I'm going to hit on that again. Just have that in mind as we begin this definition. So, administration of water and food, even when provided by artificial means, always represents a natural means of preserving life, not a medical act. It's very important. Its use, furthermore, should be considered in principle ordinary and proportionate, and as such, morally obligatory, insofar as and until it is seen to have attained its proper finality, which in the present case consists in providing nourishment to the patient and alleviation of his suffering. There's tons packed into that little paragraph, a lot. So I'm going to break it down just a little bit for you. So the fact that it is, so first I'm going to talk about that reality of means and what it is. We always have to provide food and water and technically shelter. Those are the three things every human being has a right towards: food, water, and shelter. As best as we possibly can, it's obligatory. Morally obligatory. In that third line, so always represents a natural means of preserving life, not a medical act. Because the reality is we have the moral ability, freedom, to reject medical care. I'm going to get more particular about that in a little bit, but just remember that. We have the freedom to reject medical care, to refuse medical treatment. We know that legally, Like when the EMT shows up and you didn't want someone to call the ambulance and they say, we're going to take you to the hospital in the ambulance, you can refuse to get in the ambulance. There's all sorts of things they have to say to you at that point so they don't get sued, but you can refuse treatment. When a doctor comes and tells you you have this kind of cancer, we can treat it through surgery or chemotherapy, or we can do nothing. You can always choose nothing. You're free to do that. It just comes with a lot of conversation and all that. So you're free to refuse medical acts. Food and hydration are not medical acts, so you can't refuse them. I wrote my master's thesis on something called VSED, voluntarily stopping eating and drinking. It's all the rage in places where physician-assisted suicide is not accepted. It's a legal means of assisting someone to commit suicide. Someone chooses to not eat anymore and to not drink, and they falsely tell people it's painless. You just slip into a coma and then drift off into nothingness. That's not true. Anybody who's been thirsty for more than a day or two knows the pains of beginnings of dehydration. Anybody who's fasted for more than a week, if you've done that, it also leads to a lot of pain before you slip into the coma. So often these people will ask for palliative care or morphine to help ease their suffering. And essentially what we're doing is helping someone kill themselves by not eating. That's to be different than the fact that when we're really sick or close to death, we lose our appetite. Two very different things. One person who can still eat and could still eat chooses not to. Another person who can't just simply loses the desire for food. Two very different moral objects there. Something important to remember. And furthermore should be considered in principle, ordinary, proportionate, and as such morally obligatory. So when we're talking about food and hydration, providing food and hydration, we can never deny food and hydration. What we can talk about when it comes to the idea of denying or removing is the means by which food and hydration is delivered. So it's not a question of what, but of how. What is food and hydration? Always obligatory, period. No questions asked. How is that delivered is the question. Because what happens is an example. Let's say that an older gentleman has stomach cancer, but hasn't progressed to the point that they can't digest food yet. But they also can't chew because they've lost the ability to swallow from a stroke. I went and saw a case like this. That person was receiving food through the nasal gastric tube, so a tube through their nose into their stomach, and everything was working just fine for a number of months. The food was being assimilated, it was being digested, it was actually helping their body to relieve suffering, those kind of things. It was working well. But as the stomach cancer progressed, it became clear that the food was not being digested or even moved out of the stomach, and thus was causing great pain within the stomach. So the deliverance of food was not fulfilling its purpose, which was to provide nutrition and hydration. And so the means, the nasal gastric tube, was no longer fulfilling its purpose and thus could be removed. We're not denying food and hydration, we just don't have a way to get it to the person. We're not morally obliged to do the impossible. If someone can't receive food and hydration, you can't force feed them, which causes more pain. So that's a very clear example. There's other times where because of, like, if they're receiving food through the intral path, so it's directly into their stomach, those sites where it goes into their abdominal cavity can become infected very easily. If it becomes repeatedly infected and it's causing greater danger to their life, again, food and hydration should be delivered, but that means it's no longer working the way it should. So we can remove that means because it's no longer doing what it ought to do. We're not denying them food and water, we just can't deliver it that way anymore. Does that distinction make sense? Is that clicking for the most part? So that's why you can start food and hydration at some point, but it's always a constant question of, is this still doing what it's supposed to be doing? Actually feeding and hydrating the person. Another example that often happens is someone who has kidney disease of some kind, like end-stage diabetes, the kidneys are no longer working, And to give them hydration causes there to be swelling throughout the body, which can be very, very painful. So hydration is no longer possible. You can't give them water, and to do so is actually harmful. You're no longer obliged to continue giving them hydration because it can't fulfill its finality, as St. John Paul II said in that paragraph. So does that make sense? It's always a question of, is this food and water doing what it's supposed to be doing or not? If it's not, we can then have the conversation about, can we remove it? All right? It's very important to know those very basic distinctions in that. And I didn't use this exact language because it can get confusing, but you'll see this if you read about it. These words that he used in this paragraph, an ordinary and proportionate. So I gave you the definition from the ERDs of proportionate and disproportionate means. We're going to talk about that a lot, and it's something that you hear all the time in ethical questions around end of life and even beginning of life. So, proportionate means are those that in the judgment of the patient offer a reasonable hope of benefit and do not entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on the family or the community. Disproportionate means are those that in the patient's judgment do not offer a reasonable hope or benefit or entail an excessive burden or impose excessive expense on the family or the community. Vitally important in both these definitions, in the judgment of the patient, there is a relative degree to questions of morality at times. Morality is not relative, but sometimes the application of the principles needs to be put into the particular situation. All right, so the question of this comes, I actually had this case that came up, was a family. The person needed ongoing ventilation and ongoing very expensive antibiotics pretty much, and literally the family could not afford it,